Top 10 hardest bosses that were not end bosses in World of Warcraft. You know what number 1 is? Spine of Deathwing. I can already guarantee you it's going to be Spine of Deathwing. All right, let's go.
We'll be going over the hardest raid bosses in the game that were not the end boss of their raid.
Okay.
Which is usually the hardest boss in whichever raid you're doing.
All right.
And at number 10, we have Ouro. This boss actually holds the record for being the longest a boss has gone unkilled while it was available to fight, as it took the world first 87 days to down the boss after defeating the Twin Emperors.
Okay, you gotta remember though, this is like back in Classic where like everything was fucked up. So like anything that you consider like in Classic or BC, sure. Like there were plenty of goofy things going on then, but after that, I'm really kind of curious what's gonna be beyond that. Or yeah, it was bugged or something. Like I don't know if this counts.
Ouro was basically just an optional boss in AQ40.
Yeah.
So no one really cared too much.
He's a bug.
The reason the boss went unkilled for so long was because the boss was just kind of buggy. Which was also the same reason Cthulhu went unkilled for so long.
Okay,
Ouro had this mechanic called Sandblast, which would do a huge 180-degree cone in front of Ouro and stun all targets hit for 5 seconds.
And it drops their aggro.
He would always target the player with the highest threat.
Yep.
So the way you're supposed to handle the ability was to just have your tanks alternate kiting the boss to the direction which doesn't hit the raid.
Yeah, that's
and
what we do
have
now.
The off tank it to the other direction.
Exactly.
Which should account for not hitting the entire raid and getting them stunned. It would also wipe the threat from any targets that it hit. So the tanks would have to have a steady rotation of always being ready to take up the threat, otherwise it would just start one-shotting all the healers. However,
it would not start one-shotting all of the healers because they'd be in ranged. He'd be one-shotting all of the melee, and that's what happens to our raid every single week. Every single week we have DPS warriors that die because Ouro gets knocked out of range, and they pull aggro, and they die.
Sandblast was only supposed to hit 2 times. But instead would go off a total of 4 times before it stopped using it, which meant it basically hit everyone in the raid since there was no way for tanks to kind of position it in time with the threat wipe. And if tanks did manage to deal the buggy Sandblast ability, he also had another ability where he would just go underground and then never come up. Because of these 2 bugs and the fact that he was an optional boss and no one really needed
he just starts hiding from you. He's like, oh, you can't get me now, oh shit. Yeah, he's just hiding. That's great, man. What a terrible boss.
Kill. They just kind of left him alone and worked on Cthulhu instead.
Probably a good idea.
Who was the big boss that everyone wanted to kill.
Yeah.
Who was equally bugged and a whole bunch of things that made him unkillable
Yeah,
as well.
Cthulhu was completely
Eventually, they fixed the Sandblast ability to not hit 4 times in a row.
Yeah.
And of course, they allowed him to actually come back up from the ground so that he could be attacked.
That's actually really fucking funny.
I
like
got
that.
their kill in Cthulhu.
That's really fucking funny.
Just 1 day later, since no one really bothered to work on him very much. I'm not really sure how difficult Ouro really was, but he should definitely make a list like this. So
Ouro was really hard because he did a lot of damage. Ouro had extremely high damage on a tank. Like Ouro was like, imagine Ouro is just a big dick and he's just slapping your tanks around. And like, so you got to keep that. No, he did. Like, you got to heal him up as much as you can. And that's what made Ouro so hard. It wasn't actually because not ooh, no, man. That's, you guys think you're really cute, huh?
Adding him at the number 10 spot seems pretty reasonable.
Okay.
All the other ones on this list actually had guilds wanting to do attempts on them.
Yeah, Ouro's
and at
fun.
number 9, we have Fetid Devourer.
Oh, dude.
On the mythic version of this fight, it was supposed to be a patchwork style DPS check. So if you didn't have high enough gear, this boss would show you that you weren't really ready for the final boss.
This boss was awesome. I loved this boss. Yeah, I love this fucking boss. I remember whenever Rich and I casted this, so Method had a strat that the Ring of Peace would knock Fetid Devourer back. So Method's original strategy for this boss, my understanding of it, was that they were going to just spam Rings of Peace and keep Fetid Devourer locked in place and prevent him from doing any mechanics, and then just kill him. But apparently he was so hard that they could never actually get it in place and make it happen because of how ridiculously difficult the boss fight was. It was crazy.
So the fight itself was very simple and only lasted 6 minutes.
Yeah.
Which is super short for a regular raid
This was
fight,
really hard
but
fight.
pretty standard for a DPS check. And one of the mechanics the boss had was 3 little eggs would spawn in the room.
Yep.
2 small ones and a big one.
And a big one.
And while they existed, all they would try to do is get off a cast of an ability called Inciting Essence. which would just call the boss over to eat them, and then heal him for 30% of his health.
Yeah, it's
which
a wipe.
was basically a wipe,
yeah.
because you wouldn't be able
wipe.
to DPS him down before the enrage timer if he healed for so much.
Yeah,
So
this boss is
obviously
fucking
killing
ridiculous.
those 3 eggs when they spawned was a huge priority.
Absolutely.
But when the boss first came out, they had so much health that it was almost impossible to kill a single one of them before he ate them and healed up.
Yep.
In fact, they had too much health where they was basically just overtuned. And
Well, it was completely overtuned, and even Blizzard acknowledged that it was overtuned. Like, they said, like, yeah, we just kind of fucking put it up to 11. We'll just see how it goes. You know, just see what the kids can do. Oh, man. I would be so mad if I was a high-end raider.
Blizzard had to apply 2 nerfs to the fight within the first couple of days
nerfs.
before the world first was achieved. So it did fulfill his job of being a DPS check.
Yeah,
it's
he was.
just the DPS check was too high.
Way
which
too
made
high.
it very difficult.
It's
Way
fucking
more difficult
insane.
than it should have been compared to everything else in the raid.
Exactly.
The DPS requirements were kind of on par with the final boss Cahoon.
Yeah.
Although it got fixed quickly, and the world first was achieved after only 133 attempts. which
Only
isn't that bad.
133.
So it only makes it number 9 on this list.
Yeah, it was pretty fucking
And at
good.
number 8, we have Siegecrafter Blackfuse from the Siege of Orgrimmar.
Dude, this boss was one of the coolest bosses that Blizzard has ever made. Like, I really think, like, Siege of Orgrimmar, like, this is probably, I like this boss fight probably more than Garrosh. This is one of the coolest, most challenging, interesting boss fights that they have ever done. I love this shit.
This fight was downed after 230 attempts,
Yeah.
and was one of the harder fights in Siege of Orgrimmar, and basically because it had a lot of tough mechanics at its heroic difficulty.
Yep.
The fight had this laser beam which would target a random raid member and then follow them around for a bit,
Yeah,
leaving
and
behind
you couldn't
fire
kite
that
it
needed to
through
be
the raid.
avoided for basically the rest of the fight.
Yep.
And since the laser beam would start hitting people as soon as it targeted them, you couldn't really have designated areas to put all the fire in. So you just had constant streams of fire throughout the entire raid fight.
And I liked it so much because of that, because you had to make, like, Siegecrafter was one of those fights that there were so many random variables that you couldn't have the zombies in your raid that you could just program to do X, Y, and Z. Like, they had to actually make, like, organic decisions inside of the fight. It was so well designed. Like, this is one of the coolest fights that Blizzard has ever made.
just had to deal with and not run inside of. Periodically throughout the fight, a couple of robots would spawn in the corners of the room, who would then cause a little safety dance where drills would pop out of the ground and hit everyone in its radius.
Yeah,
and since
burn
this
down.
happened basically throughout the entire fight, there was a lot of movement involved in trying to run to the robots to destroy them, so they would stop the
I wonder if they're
going
going
to
to put Lotheb
and
on
also
this
running
list.
out of the fires and avoiding the other raid members' flames that they left on the floor. And of
Yep.
course, the constant bombs that would spawn and slowly walk towards players until they killed them. Or in
By players, what he means to say is the elemental shaman, enhancement shaman in my raid. Like, we had this enhancement shaman in my raid that did really, really good damage, but he just could never do mechanics. Like, he just couldn't do it. I don't know why. He just didn't know how to do mechanics, period. So we had so many people. It was him and this other guy. I think his name was Reg, right? We had Reg doing it. There's one other guy that kept blowing up mines in the raid. Oh, that was me. Yeah, because I wouldn't want to get out of the boss. Like, I told the raid, I was like, I will stay in and wipe the raid before I lower my damage. I said, listen, we can pull this boss as many times as we want, but I only have one chance a week to parse. I'm going to make it count. And so if I die, everybody's coming with me. It is what it is. Yeah, that was me.
until the bomb itself was killed,
Exactly.
which required constant kiting. And while all of this was going on, there was
Yep.
also a belt phase that a couple of your DPS players would have to go solo, where they would hop into the corner of the room and go on a conveyor belt.
This
and
was
DPS
really
down
fun.
some of the robot parts. If the DPS players failed their mission and died on the conveyor belts,
Yeah, it would immediately kill you. On Mythic difficulty, it did 9 million damage, like basically 10 million damage. So there is no way for you to avoid the fire things. So if you couldn't do the conveyor belts properly, there's no way that you could get through it. You had to learn how to do them. And you had to have multiple people doing them at the same time.
then it was basically an instant wipe for the group. So
Oh,
while
it was
you
on
had a
heroic,
full raid
yeah,
of
yeah.
a whole bunch of mechanics and constant
Well, you know what I
movement,
mean.
You could also just fail the entire fight if the DPS players on the belt messed up their job.
Exactly.
I remember when I progressed on this raid back in Mists of Pandaria.
Exactly.
I'd say more than half of our total wipes were just because a DPS player died on the belt, and we had to reset so they could try again.
Yep.
The belt had its own little Frogger segment where you had to DPS while moving, which was kind of difficult for a solo raid mechanic, which would make or break your attempts.
Well, it was
Generally, you don't want one person to have to do such a hard job in order to allow the entire raid group to succeed.
Well, that's why it was so good. That's why it was so good. It's like, this was the raid boss. Like, you would have a lot of raids that were stuck on this boss because they had like 10 good players in the raid and they had 15 other not so good players in the raid. And they could never get past Blackfuse because they couldn't base all of the they couldn't build all of the responsibilities around those 10 players.
Which is exactly what the belt entailed in Siegecrafter.
Yeah, this separated the raids from the circuses.
So it was kind of a design they tried out, and then
That's
they
basically
really
how
went
it
back
worked.
on requiring DPS players to have that much solo responsibility.
Yeah, it was fucking awesome.
And
I love
generally,
this fight.
if one player makes or breaks the raid, it's usually the job of one of the tanks. And at number 7, we have Dark Animus. This was one of the fights in the Throne of Thunder raid and was definitely the second hardest fight in that raid instance, right behind Lei Shin, the Thunderlord, the final boss.
Here's how you can tell that this boss was really hard. This boss had no achievement. There wasn't any sort of gimmick that you had to do for this boss because the boss was so fucked up and so fucking annoying on its own that it was the only boss in all of Throne of Thunder that had no gimmick achievement. Because the boss itself was a fucking gimmick, number 1. And number 2, fuck this boss. Number 3, I hate this boss. Number 4, oh my god, I'm just thinking about it. Oh my god, it was so bad. It was so bad. It was so fucking bad. Like, you had to have... I'll let him explain it. And if he doesn't explain it, I will.
And Dark Animus had an impressive wipe count for its world first attempt.
Yeah, it was insane.
Clocking in at 333 wipes before the first kill was achieved. Which is only slightly less than the world first of Mythic Jaina from Battle of Dazar Lore. It was downed after 343 attempts.
God damn.
So what was so difficult about Dark Animus? Well,
Keeping
the
all
fight
the ads in
itself
place.
was basically math the fight.
Yeah.
The way the encounter would work was the boss himself, Dark Animus, would basically wipe the group if his energy bar got to 100.
Yep.
Which is known as anima. He
Oh,
would
just
start
like
the
in
fight with
Shadowlands.
0 anima, and in heroic difficulty, he would start draining anima from all the robots in the room after 2 minutes had passed. And since there were about 25 robots in the room, it would completely fill its energy reserves after 4 casts of the ability, which it would use every 5 seconds or so after it's...
And so you would keep the boss, you'd keep some of the golems alive because you couldn't afford to kill the golems because whenever the golem died, it would put the anima into Dark Animus. So also on top of that, these little anima golems, if they get next to each other, they enrage. So if you had 2 of these fuckers next to each other, they just go and you just die. Like, I'm not even kidding you. Like, so if one person did it wrong, everybody else would just die. It was the worst. Did they hit hard? They hit very hard, and if you had 2 of them grouped up, only a tank could tank 2 of them, and 3 of them was impossible. It would just one-shot you.
Started using it. And the way you managed this mechanic so that you wouldn't die after 20 seconds was in the
Killed the
fact
small
that
ones,
Dark
the medium
Anima
ones.
would only absorb 1 anima per robot that it absorbed from.
Yep.
So if you simply move the anima from the smaller robots to the bigger ones, you wouldn't be able to absorb as much anima as quickly.
You kill the small
and
ones
the
next to the
massive
big ones.
anima golems in the room could hold about 36 anima each.
Yep.
And each of the small robots had 4 anima.
Keep
and the
track.
way you transfer the anima was to simply kill the robots next to the bigger ones.
Exactly.
And that was basically the whole fight. Just moving all of the smaller robots next to the bigger robots so that you can move their energy into
The meta was one big
that
one
way,
alive
once
and then
Dark
the boss.
Animus started absorbing everyone's energy, it would have less
I
robots
think.
to do it from, giving you more time to kill the boss before he reached 100 energy and wiped the group.
Yep.
Now, here's where the massive amounts of wipes came in.
Look at the skeletons, by the way. Look at the skeletons that are all around these guys. This is back in the day, so I remember this in Mogushan Vaults. We tried to do stone, the first boss, the stone guards or whatever, And our tanks were terrible. Obviously, tanks were terrible. And we had so many skeletons that everybody's frame rate would go down by about 20, about 2 hours into the raid, because there are so many skeletons and we had died so many times.
The little robots would gain a super buff if they were standing next to any other robot, which would basically increase their damage by about 3 times and allow them to one-shot whoever they hit.
It was insane.
And since there were so many little robots in the room, you basically had to have everyone in the raid pick up one robot to take care of and just hold on to it until it was safe to kill it next to another one of the bigger robots.
So you had every single person in the raid was tanking one. So you had like some fucking, if you have a dipshit resto shaman, that dumbass had to get aggro on an anima golem. And guess what happens? Usually they'd mess it up. Like, and so then they're about, oh, I want the aggro, and you see him. And then as soon as he goes near the other ad, they fucking get that electric buff and they're like, poof! And they just go right across the map and kill whoever they have aggro on. It was so fucking bad, man. Like, I hated this boss.
But if you accidentally pull the little robots over someone else's robot, or just one of the stationary robots in the room, since they would also grant the buff, then the robot might accidentally one-shot you, and then run to the highest aggro target next, which was usually a healer. And then run through a whole bunch of other robots on the way, which would cause those robots to one-shot whoever they were on, and would just cascade into a wipe very quickly.
Basically, imagine this boss fight is trying to set up dominoes during an earthquake. Basically, like, trying to set up dominoes during an earthquake. As soon as you get like 1 or 2 of them up, oh, the other one's falling down, and then the other one knocks all the other ones over, and it's a wipe again. Like, most Dark Animus fights lasted for about 33 seconds. Like, most attempts were about 33-second attempts. Because the hardest part of the fight was the very beginning. Because that's whenever you had all the ads.
So you needed all 25 people in the raid to have perfect positioning with the robot they had assigned to them. And you also had to have everyone pick up all the robots instantly as soon as the fight started, without letting any of them cross and one-shot people.
Guess how many times we did a poll and somebody wasn't ready? And so their anima golem just ran right by them. Like, dude, just watching this video triggers me. Like, it triggers me so much. Like, I remember this happened, and it was so fucking annoying, man.
As you can imagine, this led to a lot of very early wipes. Where nearly half of the 330 wipes were within the first 25 seconds of the fight. And there were also problems if they accidentally killed the robot too early. As they would try to get the robot as low as health as possible, and then that way they could then move it to the bigger robot when it was time to move the anima to them. But if the dots they had on the robot accidentally crit a few too many times in a row, or someone else accidentally placed a dot on someone else's robot, they could completely screw over the handling of the small robots and cause them to transfer anima to something else, or even give it to the boss, which was really bad. So it was all about positioning, making sure you DPS'd very slowly, and we're very good at basic math of having all of the 4 anima robots move over to the 36 anima robots without letting any of them cross paths. And at number 6, we have Star Augur. This is one of the middle bosses available in the Nighthold raid, and had a few...
I just want to remind everybody, every time that we talk about Star Augur, I want to remind everyone that I had the rank 1 world parse for all classes on Star Augur back in Nighthold. And for those who don't believe it, it's actually highlighted on my stream right now. And anybody can go down and look at it. And that was back whenever I was good at the game. And Star Augur was a terrible fight that I absolutely hated, but I was really good at it.
Things going on that made it a tiny bit more difficult than it probably should have been. One of them was its star sign mechanic, where periodically throughout the fight,
this was not the difficult part
a couple of random
of the fight.
raid members would be marked with a star sign, which they had 10 seconds to remove by simply running into another player who had the exact same sign as them. The way you could tell these apart was each one of them had a different color and a little mark above your head. But also, if you ran into someone who did not have the exact same sign as you, or if it fell off without you getting rid of it through the mechanic, then it would explode and deal damage to the entire raid. And also put a debuff on everyone, which lasted for 2 minutes, which would increase the damage of the next explosion by 200%.
No, it would not increase the damage of the next explosion by 200%. It would increase all damage taken by 200%. One grand trine that goes off was an instant raid wipe. it was an instant raid wipe. Like, you could not kill the boss with Grand Trine unless it happened at like 5% of the boss fight left. Like, that was it. Like, he would one-shot anybody else past that. It was insane, man. This fight was fucking ridiculous.
So basically, the raid could survive one going off, but not two.
Exactly.
So you were very heavily incentivized to not get this mechanic messed up.
Not exactly, but yeah.
And it was pretty difficult to do. This is kind of the same reason Unat has one of the highest amount of raid wipes in the game's history.
He has the same mechanic.
Because it had a similar mechanic in its first phase, which caused all kinds of problems.
This fight was an absolute ass cock as well. Like, I didn't like this fight at all. But nameplate shit made this fight way too easier. I'll let him explain it, and then I'll explain why it was actually hard, okay?
Created an artificially inflated wipe counter. Although this mark wasn't really the hard part of the fight. No. It was actually the DPS race towards the end. During the final stretch of the last 30% of his health, he would enter a void phase and do a whole bunch of stacking mechanics on people, which would not go away and just keep adding more and more to heal through until the party just wiped. So you just had to DPS them really fastly. And this part was a little bit over-tuned and was hard to deal with all the other mechanics as well. So eventually, they gave the fight a little bit of nerfs. They allowed players an additional 50% duration on finding someone with the same mark as them, and lowered his health by about 10%, which is a major DPS nerf.
Yeah, it was a huge nerf, especially considering it was a very high damage fight. One of the other reasons why this fight was hard is you had overlapping mechanics. So the damage check was not really that bad. The damage check was only bad in a context of so many fatal mechanics occurring at the same time. So the odds are that, like, if you got into the third phase with 20 people alive, you had a damn good shot at actually killing the boss. But there was also a really high chance that that wouldn't happen, because you'd have somebody die. And you had in phase 1, during like the frost phase, you had these little fucking pylons that would move around, except for the pylons. Here's what it was like. It's like, imagine this was the ground, and then the pylons were, let's see, what color were they? They were like this color. So you can barely fucking see them. Like, you can barely see the pylons moving around. And so you can kind of get an idea of where they're at, but you can't visually discern them immediately. So it's much more difficult to be able to tell, like, right off the bat, oh, this is where that thing's at. This is where that thing's at. So you'd have people that would run into the pylons, and then they would die. So you had a number of fucking things happening in this fight. And then in phase 2, you had, like, this was a really great fight, but some of the mechanics were just ridiculously fucking overtuned. Like, they were insanely hard. I would have to say, though, this was a fight that I wish I had progressed with a top guild on. Because I feel like it would have been so much fun to do. Because, like, for our guild, we just had so many wipes to, like, people just, like, doing mechanics wrong. It was boring.
So, the final phase was nowhere near as much of a DPS race. And at number 5...
No, they didn't nerf warriors! Oh, this is for the fucking beta. Who gives a shit? Who cares?
We have Vaelastrasz the Corrupt. This is the second boss in the Blackwing layer, one of the very first raids added to the game, and was considered quite difficult for its time. Although in classic WoW, it's more of a speed bump than it was the guild breaker that it was in the original vanilla WoW. You see, this boss was kind of unique in the fact that it was required to progress throughout the rest.
In classic WoW, this boss was not a road bump or a speed bump. This boss was not even a bump. This boss was like a... It's like, imagine like you're driving around and you drive over a water bottle. That's what it was like. That's how much of a threat he was in classic WoW. Yeah, you just drive over a water bottle.
So the raid, and required a lot of personal responsibility with its mechanics. The biggest thing of this fight was its shortened rage time.
Mechanic. Let's be clear here, Hirumaredx. Mechanic. It had one mechanic,
which was definitely helped along with the buff you would cast on people called Burning Adrenaline.
Yep.
This would essentially give the player 1 minute to live and double their damage, but it had the downside where it would kill you once the duration ended, and kind of blow up and damage everyone else next to you. So once you were chosen with Burning Adrenaline, you'd want to do as much damage as possible without pulling threat from the tanks, and then just run out of the raid so that you didn't blow anyone else up when it was your turn to die. The problem with this fight was the personal accountability of a 40-man raid team requiring people to actually perform a specific coordinated task like this, which was not really the norm in the early days of raiding. So you
have to understand, you know how people were really stupid back in or like whenever I play classic WoW, people are just really stupid that I interact with as a general rule. Well, in retail, they're generally smarter, but in vanilla WoW, they are the same dumb people that are in classic, but with 15 less years of knowledge and understanding of the game. So imagine that they're as dumb as the people in classic times 2. And then on top of that, multiplied by a bad computer, put into an exponential equation with bad internet, and then multiplied with like a fucking X variable with whichever parent or family member was currently interrupting them while they were raiding. So this boss was really hard in vanilla for every single reason besides the boss. Like that's what it was. Like this boss was not hard because of the boss. Do you really think retail raiders are smarter? Yeah, absolutely. Like absolutely, they're way better. Like retail players on average are way better than classic players. It's not even in the same universe. Like they are twice as good, probably 3 times as good.
Caused quite a bit of wipes and a lot of frustration in all kinds of guilds, especially since burning adrenaline could also be cast on the tanks. So there was a chance you could get unlucky and just have all of your tanks get killed. The fight was so incredibly difficult that it kind of set the precedent for the rest of the game, where Blizzard no longer made the early bosses difficult at all, so that people could actually progress into the raid and not get frustrated encountering such a hard wall so early. And for a long time, Vaelastrasz was considered one of the hardest raid bosses of all time. Although he doesn't really measure up to a lot of the actual harder raid bosses, especially with how simple his mechanics are compared to anything else we have in modern raiding. But during his time period and how inexperienced the average raider was, he was a beast.
That's what it really was, right? He was really hard for his time. But like nowadays, obviously, like the raid is just super easy. Like it's just super fucking easy. And there was also like the issue that like back in vanilla WoW, one of the reasons why people didn't kill him for so long is that you had to like he was only in the game, or he was only in the raid for like 2 hours or something, and then he would despawn. So if you didn't kill him really quickly, you were just fucked. So it was like 3 or 4 different things coming together to really make it annoying. So yeah, this boss was, it was hard for its time, but compared to nowadays standards, it wasn't even close.
And at number 4, we have Hodir from Old War. Specifically the hard mode version of Hodir.
Okay.
Old War was the golden age of hard modes.
It was.
There are more hard mode triggers in Old War than any other raid in the game.
Probably
and it was
combined.
Kind of the testing grounds for the heroic mode that eventually became the norm. As before Old War,
it was not as good. It was a downgrade over the Old Deer mode. The Old Deer hard mode was way fucking, Old War hard mode was way fucking better in all ways. It was more interesting. It was more dynamic. It made more sense inside of the fight. It was so much more fun to activate. Like I am such a big fan of the Old War hard modes. And I was really glad whenever I saw they added like a couple of them back into the game. And like, I know they did one in Terrace at the end of the spring, but like nowadays they don't even try and do that shit anymore. It was so stupid. I don't get it.
Didn't really have multiple levels of difficulties of raids.
Yeah.
And of all of the hard modes in Old War, 2 of them are pretty famous for their difficulty. One of them, of course, is the final boss, Yogg-Saron, and his Zero Lights
Firefighter,
mode,
right?
Where you had to kill him without any of the keepers helping you, and was definitely one of the hardest fights in the game's history.
Yogg-Saron, Yogg-Zero, was, in my opinion, harder than Mythic Lich King. Or sorry, Heroic Lich King, 25-man. Like, for its time, I think Yogg-Zero was harder. Because you needed to have a stronger, more defined comp for it at the beginning, because of the way that he like the insanity mechanic worked. And then on top of that, you had to, like, you didn't have as much time. Like, there was no buff for Yogg. There was no buff at all. And so the first guild that killed Heroic Lich King on 25-man killed him with the 5% buff. It was Paragon that killed him with the 5% buff. And then nobody else killed him until the 10% buff. But Lich King, or sorry, what's it called? Yogg had no buff. And you just had to go in there and deal with him. It was rough.
There was also Mimiron Firefighter, where you just pushed the red button and basically activated the heroic
Yeah, this
version
was
of the
really
same
cool too.
fight, which just had a lot more fire than normal, in addition to everything else doing more damage.
A lot more
But
damage.
actually, Hodir was the hardest non-end boss of that raid. It's just
'Cause
not
the
talked
damage
about as
check?
much because it was fixed after it was known as a problem.
Yeah.
You see, the hard mode for Hodir was pretty simple. All I had to do was kill the
him
boss
fast.
in less than 2 minutes.
Yeah.
That was it. It was just a huge Zerg trying to kill the boss as fast as possible before it could reach phase 2.
Yep.
Although the problem with this hard mode was the DPS requirement was so difficult to accomplish that it was thought to be nearly impossible.
Well, the reason why it was so hard, so like there were a couple of mechanics that were like, I can't really explain everything, right? But I guess I'll explain a few things, right? So you had storm clouds that would go on a random player, and then that random player would have to move around and apply the storm cloud buff to other players, which would give them more critical strike damage. And those beams of light would make you cast like 3 times as fast. And then there was also like these fires that you guys can see on the left there. And if you stand next to the fire, you could stand still and cast and not have to worry about getting stacks of biting cold, which is like a stacking debuff that would go up more and more and more the longer you stood still. So I think the fight was tuned around expecting everybody to have all 3 of those buffs, which was completely unrealistic. That's like, there's no way that would ever happen. It was really, really, really fucking hard. Even after the nerf, it was hard.
At least with the gear that was provided in the raid. So what some players would do in order to actually defeat this boss was they would kite some of the ads from Freya's room to Hodir. That way the mages in the raid could spell steal the pollinate buff, which would increase their damage by 25% for 30 seconds.
I don't remember this at
Although
all.
eventually Blizzard realized the fight was probably impossible.
That's smart.
So they increased the amount of time you had for the hard mode by 50% to 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And then changed the 4 Swarmer ads to no longer have the pollinate buff spell stealable. So
I
the
don't
fight
remember
would
that at
actually
all.
be doable, but still difficult.
Holy
and so that they
shit.
could no longer cheese with the 4 Swarmers.
Holy
Funny thing
shit.
is, Blizzard actually commented on the pollinate buff and said if they didn't want people to be able to spell steal it, they wouldn't have added it to the room that also had a boss inside of it.
Yeah.
It's just they were kind of expecting people to use it on Freya and not drag the ads to the other keepers' rooms and use them there. So while it may have been a difficult fight because it was hard to zerg down boss in 2 minutes, there are so many bosses that are difficult because they were overtuned that it's almost impossible to really separate their tuning from how difficult the boss was. Because there are no bosses that have world firsts that didn't have bugs or, you know, some overtuning to them.
Yeah, the world first raiders are the those are the unpaid beta testers for Blizzard, and so basically these people play the game 24 hours a day in order to beta test the content for Blizzard that they didn't have time to do themselves. So that's the way that it works.
So with keeping those constraints in mind, Hodir is technically the hardest non-end boss from Old War.
Yeah.
And I only put 1 fight per raid in these kinds of videos. But Mimiron Firefighter would definitely also make this list if I didn't have that little internal rule to just add some variety to the videos. Because rarely is it a problem, except in a case like this where everyone would probably expect to see Mimiron
Yeah, I would have.
Firefighter on the
I thought
list.
we were going to see that too.
And at number 3, we have the Spine of Deathwing.
This is only number 3? What the fuck? Oh my god. What the fuck is number 2 and 1?
A boss which had its world first achieved
Oh
after
my
214 attempts.
Maybe
And then the
Muru?
final
Yeah,
boss of the
maybe
raid was
Muru.
killed in less than 100. The Spine of Deathwing is kind of the poster
This
child
was
of a modern
fucking
raid
insane.
that had a boss in the raid which was more difficult than the final boss itself.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the bosses on this list, they weren't actually more difficult than the final boss of their raid. Yogg Zero's
I thought, dude, so like there was a bug where this Chinese guild was able to kill Madness of Deathwing before they were supposed to. And I remember seeing the video of it. And I actually thought the boss fight for Madness of Deathwing was so easy, I genuinely thought that it was bugged. I was like, there's no way that's the way it works. There's no way, it's too easy. Like, yeah, it's way too easy. There's no way they're gonna just let it be like that. And you know, what a shit fight.
definitely more difficult than Hodir. Garrosh was more difficult than Siegecrafter Blackfuse,
Yeah, he was.
etc., etc. But Madness of Deathwing,
Was
the
a joke.
actual final boss of Dragon Soul, was kind of a joke in comparison to
Exactly.
the Spine of Deathwing.
He sure
so
was.
what was so difficult about this
Exactly.
fight? 2 things really. This fight required an incredible amount of burst damage. Like, so much that it was almost unheard of for a raid fight.
This was the first fight that we really had. There was more class stacking on this fight than any other fight in the history of the game. So you had basically rogues that had the legendary daggers and mages that had Dragon Wrath. And it was like arcane mages and whatever spec of rogue that it was. And those two classes were the hardest damage Nefarian druid tank. No, there were actually more rogues and mages combined than there were druids on the Paragon kill for Nefarian. It was way more. Like, you needed almost a full raid of this comp because of how powerful and how high the damage check was. They basically cut the damage check in half, and it was still hard.
Burst damage is something that's only really useful in PvP, because generally, 99% of raid fights reward long-term damage, or AoE.
Yeah.
Not single target burst, which
Exactly.
was the most important thing on Spine of Deathwing, and hasn't really been the case ever since the Spine of Deathwing. As the way to defeat the fight was you had to pop 3 of its plates off. Once the third plate was popped off,
this was a fun fight. I really liked it.
And the way to pop off one of the plates was to DPS one of the tendons underneath the plate, which could only be revealed after you blew up one of the big elementals in the fight. And the tendon was only available to DPS for about 20 seconds at a time.
I think it was 18
so
seconds.
whichever classes could deal the most amount of damage in
you
about
would just have to
20
deep dick
with
the tendon.
Very little setup.
Like, everybody pops
prized.
these.
Which is why most of the raid teams who got the world first brought nothing but rogues and mages as their DPS. Since those two classes had some of the best burst damage in the game at the time.
I'll show you guys.
Helped along by the fact that those two...
Yeah, they were the ones that had the legendaries. Let me show you guys. World first. Spine of Deathwing. Take a look at this. They had full mages and full rogues, pretty much as all of their damage, minus like a few other people just to buff their damage. That was it. Neff had like 17 druids. Maybe, did it have 17 druids? I don't know about that. Was it 17 druids? Ooh, that's a lot of druids. Maybe you're right. Yeah, maybe you are right. I don't know. Like, I remember this had like probably, in my mind, it was like the hardest and like most intense class stacking. But regardless, like both of these were fucking insane. Like, I remember whenever we did this in my guild, we had people that were like going and doing alt raids to get Dragon Wrath on their alts just because we wanted to be able to kill this boss.
Classes also had the availability of legendary weapons.
Yeah, exactly.
That increased their damage even further. But it wasn't just the burst damage that was the problem. The healing on the fight was also incredibly
fucking
difficult.
ridiculous.
Probably one of the hardest fights to heal in the game's history as well.
Yep.
You see, there was a mechanic on the fight called Searing Plasma, which was a permanent debuff that would deal damage to the player was on.
Yeah, you had to heal it all the way
debuff
through.
was to heal the target for a significant amount of healing, because the debuff would also absorb all the healing they took, and it wouldn't go away until it absorbed a certain threshold, which was set depending on the difficulty you did the fight on, but was usually around 30% of the player's health, give or take. So it was a pretty significant chunk of healing they should put on someone just to remove a debuff. And the debuffs would periodically go out all the time. And since it never went away, if you slacked on your healing even for a little bit, where you just had to pump heals into the tanks.
Like, you basically had to overheal this, and then on top of that, I believe, I don't remember like how these ads worked. I think that some of the ads, like if they, oh yeah, if you kill the ads, there was a softened rage in the fight, because if you killed the ads, they would just like, the globule would just spawn underneath them, and it would go to one of those red areas, and then it would respawn. It was, dude, this fight was fucking ridiculous. Then you would eventually get left
behind in the healing and wiped due to not being able to heal
man.
anyone up after they took damage.
Yep.
The fight itself also had a ton of ads to micromanage, as you needed one of your tanks to constantly kite a long swarm of bloods. So the best way to deal with this healing mechanic was to just bring a Resto Shaman, because if they popped Spirit Link Totem, it could instantly get rid of the debuffs from everyone in
I
the
don't
raid.
remember us doing this,
As
actually.
what Spirit Link Totem did was it would constantly heal and damage everyone within its radius for 10 seconds, until it would equalize everyone's health. And since the process of trying to equalize the entire raid's health would involve massive amounts of healing and doing damage to the players, it would almost instantly provide enough healing in order to meet the absorbs threshold.
Well, Resto Shamans in this fight were really good too, because you had like, there was such little space that you really had in the fight, that as a Resto Shaman, your healing rain would be healing pretty much the entire raid all the time. Like Resto Shamans and like Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria were one of the most fun classes to play like ever. I remember playing Resto back in Mists of Pandaria, and I genuinely had fun doing it. Like one of the things that I really liked about it back then is you had active mana regeneration as like a shaman. It was fucking awesome. Like I feel like I don't think any of the healers have that now besides monks, right? Like it was disappointing. Like I really think that like healing in Mists of Pandaria was fucking amazing. It was actually fucking amazing.
And kind of trivialized this incredibly difficult healing mechanic. And because Spirit Link Totem was so good for dealing with this mechanic, all of the top raids that downed Spine of Deathwing basically only had 3 classes brought along.
Yeah.
Rogues, mages, and shamans. Rogues and mages do damage on the tendons, and shamans to rotate their Spirit Link Totems.
Yep.
It's probably some of the hardest class stacking that players have seen in a modern raid. And it was...
So, you would be tanking so many of these bloods at the end of it. We had to make sure that our warrior tanks repaired every single fight. Like every single time that we would do an attempt, they had to full repair because the bloods would break their gear. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that, boys.
So bad that Blizzard made all kinds of accommodations to make sure something like Spine of Deathwing wouldn't happen again.
Yeah, it was
Occasionally,
insane.
There will be fights where people class stack like crazy anyway, and it happened all the time in the early days, but Dragon Soul was supposed to be one of the modern raids after the revamp of the old world, so it...
The last raid to like really have like super bad class stacking, besides maybe Unat, was Tomb of Sargeras. Tomb of Sargeras was fucking insane. Did you wash your hands? Why would I wash my hands? I got a clean dick.
Kind of stood out at the time. And at number 2, we have Fallen Avatar from
Fallen
the Tomb
Avatar.
of Sargeras. This was the
yeah.
final boss in its raid, kind of like the Spine of Deathwing, and was so difficult it easily tops a lot of final bosses in terms of difficulty, as it took 453 attempts before...
I think Avatar is harder than like... I didn't really do it like whenever it was like super, super hard, so I can't really say, but it seemed like Avatar, like watching people do Avatar and the amount of responsibilities that you had, it feels like that boss was probably harder than like almost any other boss in the entire game. It was fucking insane.
Before the world first was achieved, which actually places it pretty high
yeah,
on the list
actually,
of
that's
bosses.
a really good way of saying it. You can't even kill this boss now. That's how fucking hard it is. Like, even now, with like everything that you have and like 2 expansions later almost, you still can't kill this boss on Mythic. Like, it's fucking ridiculous.
That took the most amount of attempts to get a world first. Now, a big reason this boss was so difficult was just played old over to
Jaden
me,
was harder?
and the fact that it had 4
Yeah.
separate soak mechanics.
4
a soak
separate
mechanic
soak
is something
mechanics.
where a void zone will pop up in some way, shape, or form, in which you want players to actually move into them so they can take the damage so it doesn't wipe the raid. Generally, you want to avoid ground clutter, but Tomb of Sargeras kind of went all in with soak mechanics and had a little bit too many of them.
It was way too many.
Where
It was
Blizzard
insane.
heavily dialed back the amount of soak mechanics afterwards because they were not very well liked in the Tomb of Sargeras. Although one of the soak mechanics was a lot more difficult than all the others, and that specifically was the Dark Mark mechanic. This was
So like even before you even got to that part of the phase, like, so you had like multiple beams going to Avatar, and if one beam hit Avatar like once, right, probably 2 or 3 times, it was pretty much a fucking wipe. So you had to deal with, on Mythic, you had to deal with the green beams, and then Mythic had purple beams as well. And each of the beams gave a stack, and then you had to rotate stacks between all of the members in your raid, while at the same time making sure that you're moving out for those daggers that he spawned, because if the dagger hit somebody else, it would drop a void zone that was there for the entire phase 1. It was fucking insane. Like, this boss was really, really, really hard.
It only happened during phase 2 when you guys fell below the room.
Yeah.
It would target 3 random players, in which case it would blow up and deal damage to that player, and then knock them into the air based on how much damage it did. You could also split this damage with as many players as possible that were also inside of it when it blew up.
Right.
And it would absolutely one-shot someone if they tried to solo soak it without a cooldown.
Yeah, you'd have to do it with
the
a CD.
intended way to handle this mechanic
like with
was
a-
to
I
have
think in
about
a
2 or 3
vulnerability.
other people stand with whoever had the Dark Mark. That way they could absorb and split the damage between each other and only get knocked back a little bit.
Yeah.
The final phase also happened on a platform with a lot of lava that you could be knocked into, which dealt a substantial amount of damage. In addition to the fact that you had to constantly dodge shadow tornadoes, and the boss himself doing a constant tick of AoE damage, which was kind of very hard to heal in the early
Oh, dude, it was so bad because so he gets Seer, right? This is his buff called Seer. And on top of Seer, if he was in the lava at all, he would gain extra stacks that would increase his damage from Seer. So it was just like, and you couldn't stop him from being in the lava all the time. So you had to just like manage this over time. Like this fight was fucking insane. Like, I really think this probably, like, I don't know what number 1 is going to be. If number 1's Muru, I think this one's way harder than Muru.
Stages of progression. Since the boss would periodically destroy part of the platform, and then he would slowly walk to the tank through the lava. But the boss would also gain a stacking buff for each second it stood in the lava, which would increase the AoE pulse damage he dealt per stack. And since you could literally not pull him onto the platform before he got 2 or 3 stacks, the fight would become unhealable before the platforms were all destroyed anyway.
Yep.
And since it was such a difficult healing check, in addition to a DPS check, if one of your few healers was chosen with the Dark Mark, then it was an instant wipe, since they did not have the healing to make up for one of the healers temporarily being unavailable for even a couple of seconds. So eventually the fight got a whole bunch of changes. They made it so the Fel Infusion mechanic would gain less stacks more frequently while he was in the lava.
Yeah, they nerfed the shit out of this fight.
They also changed Dark Marks to no longer apply to healers, and to deal significantly less damage, in addition to just nerfing the health of the avatar by 5%, which made the DPS check more bearable. And even after all of these nerfs, it still took about 100 more attempts before the World First was achieved, which should go a long way to say how difficult the original version of the fight was, if the nerfed version is still on par with Madness of Deathwing in terms of attempts.
This boss was, in my opinion, like, it's going to have Muru is going to be the last one. There's no way that Muru is harder than this boss. Like, I can almost guarantee you that the day that Muru comes out, people are going to one-shot that boss. I really don't think it's going to be harder. Like, you got to understand, like, the way that people played TBC back then was just not efficient. They just weren't good at the game. Straight up, they were not good at the game.
And at number 1, we have Muru from the Sunwell Plateau in the Burning Crusade. This is another one of the second bosses before the final boss, and also took the number 1 spot in my top 10 hardest raid bosses of all time, including final bosses as well. Now, Muru was difficult for kind of the same reasons as Vaelastrasz the Corrupt. He had kind of a couple mechanics that were just very difficult to deal with at the time for the player's overall skill level.
Well, this fight was so hard. It was so hard that every single player in the raid was required in a lot of guilds to swap over to leatherworking so they could buy themselves drums and get that little bit of extra damage. It was fucking ridiculous. Like, for its time, Muru was like a massive step up in difficulty versus like any fight that you would come into you'd come into contact with before then. There's a blue post. I'll read the blue post after this, okay?
It will probably be trivialized once Burning Crusade Classic servers come out and everyone has had years to practice the mechanics on private servers. As what made this fight difficult was really trying to transition into its second phase. During the first phase, he had 2 main mechanics he would do. One of them was summon a group of ads periodically throughout the fight, and the other was to call in a group of ads from the back of the room, which would happen on a set timer of about once a minute.
That's a lot of fucking damage,
and the way to beat the fight was to kill both of these sets of ads before you transitions the boss into the second phase, which happened immediately after you killed the boss and he spawned Entropus.
I feel like, in general, a lot more was hard, but my god, it was so fucking boring. I didn't do it, like, the thing is, it's going to be rolled. Yeah, I think people are going to roll this boss over, and you've got to remember, like, if you compare Muru pre-nerf to Kil'jaeden pre-nerf, or sorry, Fallen Avatar pre-nerf, like, I think just obviously Fallen Avatar is way harder. Like, they had to nerf the boss multiple times for it even to be killable. So, to me, I feel like a lot of these, like, TBC and vanilla WoW bosses, I don't even think they were hard. Like, I would be really curious to see, put the players of today in front of those bosses now, and I don't even think these guys would make the list in the top 50. Like, that's the facts. Like, I can almost guarantee you, if I go and I watch a video of, like, one of the top guilds doing Muru, and then I go and I watch a video of one of the top private server guilds doing Muru, the people in a private server guild is going to be doing probably 20% more damage. They're just going to be way better. Like, that's all there is to it. They're just going to be way fucking better.
Once Entropus entered the ring, the ads would stop spawning, and he had to very quickly DPS down the boss before he killed the raid with his pulsing stacking damage.
We have Nax in 5
so
minutes.
Since his final phase was just a pure burn, where you had to kill him before he killed you, everyone in the raid needed to focus all of their damage onto the boss. And the healers had a lot to heal, as the boss was constantly dealing raid-wide AoE damage that was hard to heal under normal circumstances. Especially since the first iteration of this fight also provided spell pushback. So if you had any ads left from the previous phase, you just wouldn't be able to have the DPS to kill the boss or heal the raid. So that was basically the entire fight, just trying to hit the perfect transition where you killed all of the ads at the exact time you killed Maru, which triggered the transition phase.
It was fucking
Sounds
insane.
simple enough, right?
No, it was not.
It was actually so
it
difficult
was really
that only
hard.
5 raids managed to kill Maru before it received a major round of nerfs. And even then, raids were only killing him after that with massive class stacking and forcing everyone in the raid group to go leatherworking so they could take drums of battle.
That was the meta right there. Every single person had to go leatherworking. I was so close to respecking to leatherworking, but I was like, there's no way I'm ever going to leave blacksmithing. Like, I've been a blacksmith ever since Vanilla WoW, and I will never leave blacksmithing. It doesn't matter what it is.
Alright, and that's the video. If you want to know more about the hardest bosses in the game, regardless of their position in that raid, I'd highly recommend watching my video on the top 10 hardest raid bosses of all time, which will be linked at the end of this video.
I will probably watch that at some point.
This video was edited by The Flying Buttress, who's an excellent, highly underrated
I'll probably
YouTube
watch
channel.
that at some point.
If you enjoy highly edited World of Warcraft videos, I would definitely recommend you check them out. Links to him and all my other stuff will be at the end of the video right now.
That was a good video, man. That was a really good fucking video. I feel like all of these are pretty well aggregated. I think Ouro probably shouldn't have been on the list. And let's see, all of the other bosses like Vael probably shouldn't have been on the list either, because many of the difficulty like mechanics were there was so much more contextual around why they were hard, around like the time that they were difficult. Like the other bosses afterwards were objectively challenging. Like, many of the other ones afterwards were not objectively challenging. So I think that's really what the difference is.